Hi, this is Simon, and this is a brief video about audio compression. A good question to ask after I say that is, what kind of compression are we talking about? Because when we talk about compression in audio, we're generally talking about two different things. We might be talking about dynamic range compression or data compression. In dynamic range compression, you reduce the difference between the loudest and quietest parts of your recording. In data compression, you reduce the amount of data that you're using to represent the audio. These two processes share the name compression, and to add to the confusion, both of these compression are controversial components of our discussion of modern audio quality. Dynamic range compression gets brought up in the loudness wars. Data compression comes up talking about streaming services and other internet distributed audio. Let's start by looking at dynamic range compression. To compress the dynamic range, we simply take the loudest parts of a recording and we make them quieter. We reduce those loudest points so they're not quite so loud. Why would we want to do this? Let's think a little bit about what this means. Starting out, the dynamic range of human hearing, the range from the quietest sound we can hear to the loudest sound we can hear, is about 130 or 140 decibels. This means in an ideal environment, a concert hall, this is the range of dynamics we can hear through fluctuations in air pressure. Let's remember though that digital audio with its limited resolution does not have the same dynamic range. 16 bits of audio CD quality sound only has a dynamic range of about 98 decibels, significantly lower than our hearing's dynamic range. Furthermore, other media such as radio have an even more limited dynamic range. So what do? So given the limits of the media and the listening environment, we might need to compress audio to take up a smaller dynamic range in order for us to hear it clearly. We can, however, just cut out the loudest parts of our signal. To do so would be to introduce some digital clipping. If we just cut off that top, we get flat lines of samples, which will introduce some harmonic distortion that we don't want. So instead, what we want to do is take these loud parts and round them off. And to accomplish this, we'll use an aptly called device, the compressor. Compressors are hardware or software units that apply dynamic range compression. There's a wide range of compressors that are available as free or paid plugins, and you can pay as much for a compressor as you want to. But compressors will generally share the same controls. First, a threshold. The threshold is where the compressor is going to start compressing. This is the amplitude at which a sound will be attenuated. Next, once a sound has crossed that threshold, we think about the ratio. How much are we going to reduce that level once the sound has crossed the threshold? Are we going to reduce its amplitude by half, by a quarter, etc.? Compressors will also usually have attack and release controls. Attack is the amount of time it takes the compressor to start reducing the amplitude. And the release is the time it takes the compressor to stop reducing the amplitude once the signal returns below the threshold. Finally, compressors will usually have a gain control. Gain controls the overall amplitude of the signal after compressing. It's important to remember that compression makes things quieter. We're taking the loudest parts and then we're reducing their amplitude. Usually, though, we associate compressors with making things louder, and that's because of this gain, because once we reduce the amplitude of the loudest parts, we then increase the gain to make the entire signal louder, so making the quieter parts louder. After compression, material that has a wide dynamic range, for example, quiet parts that would have been lost in an FM radio transmission, compression brings those quiet and loud parts closer together in dynamic range, perhaps creating a better presentation for a given listening environment or media. Back to our two definitions, let's now talk about data compression. In data compression, we're reducing the amount of data used to represent audio. So the dynamic compression that we were just talking about has no effect on the file size. Looking at these two Nirvana MP3s, we can see that they're the exact same file size, even though the remaster has a significant amount more dynamic compression going on. The sound of these two are going to be very, very different, But that dynamic range compression has no effect on the file size. Data compression will, though. If an audio file has the same length, sample rate, and bit depth, it's going to be the same size regardless of dynamic compression. Why compress the data in audio? There are a few reasons. One, we could optimize storage space. One reason for that could be portability too. It's far easier to carry around a greater number of songs if they've been made into smaller files. And then sometimes playback of compressed audio can be faster. This is thinking about game engines and things like that. Sometimes it can be preferable to store a compressed file in the computer's memory. Let's think about the data per second on an audio CD. Again, CD quality audio, 44.1 kilohertz and 16 bits. If we multiply those together, we get the number of bits per second, 705,600. Remember, CDs are stereo audio, so we should multiply that by 2, one for the left, one for the right. We get about 1.4 million bits per second. To move to more useful units, that's 1,411 kilobits per second, kbps. This is the bit rate of an audio CD. Just a reminder, it's very important to understand that bit depth and bit rate are different terms and mean different things. We're now talking about bit rate, which is useful to understand for data compression. 1,411.2 kilobits per second is the number of binary digits per second, the number of zeros and ones per second a CD reads. Turning to MP3s, common bit rates are significantly lower. 128 isn't so common nowadays, but 160 and 320 are. 320 is usually labeled a high-quality MP3 if you're downloading music from Bandcamp or other online sources. But if we look at 128 kbps, that's about an 11th of as much data being read and transmitted as an uncompressed CD. To look at 320, that's about a quarter of the data per second. So if you care about your streaming bandwidth or the space on your computer, these save you significantly in that dimension. Broadly, there are two types of data compression, lossless and lossy. As you might assume from the names, in lossless compression, the original data and the data after decompression are exactly the same. And in lossy compression, some of the data is lost in the compression and then decompression process. The reason lossy compression exists, though, is that you can make files smaller with lossy compression than with lossless. The way data compression, both lossless and lossy, works, it looks for patterns in the data that can be represented in a smaller way. So for example, if I write A, that would be 6 characters, but I can represent that by writing 6 A's, and that's only 3 characters. The way lossy compression works is, in addition to looking for those patterns, it also thinks about psychoacoustic masking to decide whether some data can be removed. It's making a guess as to whether we will perceive that that information has been removed or not. So it takes advantage of the idea of masking. There's frequency masking and amplitude masking, but the general idea is that while the waveform is not going to be precisely the same thing after compression and decompression, our perception of it is going to be almost the same. When we use data compression, we need to be able to both compress and decompress the data. When you listen to an MP3, you're actually listening to a decompressed version of the MP3. Your computer or phone has decompressed the stored audio and made a restored version of it. That decompressed series of samples of discrete amplitudes goes through your computer's DAC, digital audio converter, and then they go through the electroacoustic transducer, your speakers or headphones. So there are several different programs we use to compress and decompress, code or decode digital signals. We call these programs codecs. A codec that we commonly hear about is MP3, MPEG-1 or MPEG-2, Audio Layer 3. There's some debate about which codecs actually sound the best, but there's little debate that MP3 has the most name recognition. In the early days of compressed audio with Napster and other download sites, MP3 became synonymous with compressed music. When I was a freshman in college, my friend down the hall got one of these Rio MP3 players, which had a whopping 32 megabytes of internal memory, so he could hold about 30 minutes of MP3s. The first iPod didn't come around until 3 years later in 2001. There are lots of audio codecs that you might encounter, and as a professional, it's particularly important for you to understand which are lossy and which are lossless. So, in distributing audio, it's very important for us to understand the two meanings of compression and how we can implement both in the finishing of audio in a way that's appropriate for the media and listening space that it will be heard in.